The Tower of Babel was never about languages, not about words. So why did it matter to God? It was about power. And what happens when too much of it gathers in one place? Everyone knows the story. Humanity speaks one language. They build a tower that reaches the heavens. God gets angry. Languages are confused. People scatter. End of story. But that version is convenient, because it turns Babel into a children's tale about miscommunication, when in fact, it's one of the oldest warnings ever written about power. In the next minutes, we're going to take Babel apart, not to demystify it, but to understand what it was really describing, what one language actually meant, why the tower mattered so much, what God interrupts, and what he doesn't, and why division wasn't a punishment, but an outcome. I'm Alex, and this is The Naked History.
Stories survive because they get repeated, and when they're repeated enough, they get simplified. Details disappear, meanings flatten, and eventually, the story becomes harmless. The Tower of Babel is one of those stories. This story was not asking, how do people speak? It was asking something far more dangerous. What happens when everyone obeys the same voice? Everyone knows how this story goes. After the flood, humanity speaks one language, the same words, the same commands, so they decide to build a city, and at its center, a tower so tall it can reach the heavens. According to Genesis 11, this happens long before kings, nations, or empires. At least that's how the story presents it. In reality, the version we read today was likely written down around the 6th century before Christ, at a time when massive empires already ruled the world. God sees the tower, and he intervenes. Languages are confused. People stop understanding each other. The project collapses. Humanity scatters across the earth. For centuries, this has been read as a simple lesson. Human pride went too far. God punished it. A neat moral story. But there's something strange about this version. Because the text doesn't describe chaos. It describes coordination. People speaking as one, acting as one, building together. Efficiently. And that raises a quiet question. If this story were really about arrogance, why focus so much on unity? When we hear one language, we imagine people speaking the same words, the same vocabulary, the same sounds. But in the ancient world, language didn't mean what it means to us today. Around the 3rd and 2nd millennia before Christ, in Mesopotamia, language was not about expression, it was about coordination. Empires relied on a shared administrative language. In this region, it was Akkadian, not the language of poetry, the language of orders, the language used to record grain, to assign labor, to transmit commands across cities and regions. So when the Babel story says humanity had one language, it's not describing people talking alike. It's describing a world where everyone could understand the same instructions and act on them. That kind of unity is powerful, but it also concentrates control. Because once everyone understands the same command, the real question is no longer, can we build? It becomes, who decides what gets built? So, why a tower? If this story were about reaching God, there were easier ways, but in the ancient world, towers were not spiritual shortcuts, they were signals. Around 2100 before Christ, cities in Mesopotamia were already building massive step towers, ziggurats. One of the most famous stood in the city of Ur, the ziggurat of Ur. It didn't exist to be climbed, it existed to be seen, from far away. A tower like this said something very clear: power lives here. It marked the center. The place where orders came from, where resources were collected, where decisions were made. Building a tower was not about height, it was about centralization. A system meant to last, a structure everyone could orient themselves toward. And once that tower exists, unity stops being abstract, it becomes physical, and visible power, once established, has a habit of growing. Here's what's striking about the Babel story. God doesn't destroy the tower, he doesn't strike the builders, he doesn't erase their knowledge. Construction isn't the problem. What gets interrupted is something else. The text focuses on one thing: power acting as one language, one plan, one direction. By the time this story was written down, in the 6th century before Christ, the world already knew what that kind of coordination could produce. Empires had learned how to organize millions of people. Take the Assyrian Empire. between the 9th and 7th centuries before Christ. It wasn't fragile because it built too much. It was fragile because everything depended on a single center issuing orders. And when that center broke, everything broke with it. So when God intervenes at Babel, he doesn't interrupt technology. He introduces friction, not chaos, difference, because a system where everyone understands the same command, at the same time, from the same center, is incredibly strong and incredibly vulnerable. If total coordination is the risk, then division is not a failure, it's a consequence. And history gives us a very clear example. By the 1st and 2nd centuries of the current era, the Roman Empire ruled an enormous territory, from Britain to Judea, from the Atlantic to the Near East. Rome needed unity to function, but it also understood something crucial. Too much unity breaks empires. So Rome centralized power, but it did not fully homogenize identity. Latin was the language of administration, of law, of command. But across the empire, local languages survived: Greek in the east, Coptic in Egypt, Semitic in Judea. These languages weren't accidents, they were tolerated. They allowed regions to feel themselves without threatening the center directly. A pressure release valve. When identity collapses into one center, resistance doesn't disappear, it hardens. So controlled fragmentation wasn't weakness, it was stability. And that's exactly what the Babel story describes, not a divine punishment, but the natural outcome of a system pushed too far toward unity. When everything moves as one, something eventually has to give. Once you see Babel this way, it stops being an ancient story. It becomes a pattern. Again and again in history, humans try to coordinate everything. One system, one standard, one center, and every time it looks efficient, rational, even peaceful, until it isn't. Because the problem with perfect coordination isn't that it fails immediately, it's that it concentrates decision-making, and when decisions flow from one place, everyone else becomes dependent on it. Babel isn't warning us about confusion, it's warning us about systems that leave no room for difference, no friction, no alternative paths, and when those systems grow large enough, division doesn't appear as a choice, it appears as a consequence. People fragment, not because they want to, but because they need space to breathe, different voices, different rules, different identities, not to destroy the system, but to survive it. That's why Babel still feels familiar. Because we keep rebuilding towers, just not with bricks anymore. The Tower of Babel was never about languages. It was about power, how it gathers, how it organizes, and how it eventually forces division, not as punishment, but as balance. Babel isn't a story about failure, it's a reminder. When everything moves as one, history doesn't ask if it will break apart, only how. History isn't finished. Stay curious.